today, the Gerhard's presentation will be morphology as design, and that probably will help you to understand why we are doing what we are doing. And then actually by understanding morphology and playing with morphology, actually it has a strong indication of future design. So that's the first thing I hope you can understand. I also hope you can draw some design implications, design conclusions at the end of this course. So we're not doing analysis only for the sake of analysis. This is not purely for research, it's really for designing projection for the future. So I hope this lecture can give you some insights and inspirations on that. And later on, my heritage lecture, so that is about mega projects, mega region interplay. So probably that will help you to understand how mega projects have an influence on the regional scale, and how can you use that, to identify the lower scale of analysis and projects in the later part of this course. So today, actually, you can see my setting up of the course, right? So these two lecture is placed at this moment is very essential. It will give you a lot of reflections and thinkings, right? Okay, so let's welcome Gerhard, and I'll give floor to Gerhard.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Joshua. It's actually quite strange to think that we've studied in the same institution and we are again converging onto a very different city and continent and part of the world, and we still talk about the same things. My name is Gerhard Bruyns. I'm an associate professor and associate dean of the School of Design. I hold an undergraduate degree in architecture and a master's and a PhD in urban studies from Delft. When I started studying in Delft, I remembered very clearly that at one point they said to us, you have to choose either the architecture track or the urbanism track. And it was very difficult for me to decide which one, because I always thought that as an architect, it's better to go on with architecture, because it's simply you scale up the architecture and then it's quote unquote classified as a master's level of inquiry. But very soon I realized that for me, it would be more beneficial to choose the urbanism track. And with that, it means urbanization is actually a trialectic structure, a triangle where you have society, space, and technology all coming together. And with that framework, it makes it very easy to try and understand what cities are doing and how they work. So without knowing it, I signed myself up for this lifelong inquiry, it feels, to what urbanism and urbanization really means. I will really take my time in this talk. I have, I think, only 26 slides. So I worked out if I spend a minute and a half on each slide, then it gives me enough time to allow you to also consider and think what you really see on the screen. But I want you to promise right here now, if you don't understand anything, you raise your hand and say, I don't get it. Can you repeat it? Let's not stand on this formality of someone doing a lecture. I'd rather you understand it than just sit here and like he's going on and on and on about things we don't know. In PolyU, apart from being part of this spatial and futures lab, I'm also part of a group called Transition Environmental Design, and that is really a very different way to what you understand urbanization is, or urban studies, or even urban design. But it's very interesting for us that we are this different, because I think in the end we use the same understanding or same units, and in that we somehow still converge and come to some sort of mutual understanding of the city. Plus, what also makes it interesting, we just hosted 30 Delft students that was running a similar workshop like you, but we were looking at the GBA, and there you can see the lineup of which Joshua was also a speaker. So it's I'm very happy to be able to share this with you, and maybe you learn something from this. My first question that I have for you is, can anyone explain to me the meaning of design? Anyone? What does design mean? We talk about it every day. We use it every day. We all call ourselves designers. But when I ask this question, the responses are so diverse. What do you think design is? It's a very academic answer, but okay. Anyone else? If we separate the word in two parts, it does two things. If we take the word it actually has a double meaning. The first meaning, if we take it like this, basically means we design, we take things apart, and that is an analytical premise. It means we make order and sense of the world around us and the material culture. But in the same way, if you take the word and you bring it back together again, it means it's forming propositions. It's actually putting forward certain ideas and alternatives to what could be that other people cannot imagine. The real academic definition of design is in action is actually giving material form to ideas. That's the actual hardcore definition of design. And it is that sense that I think you need to become a little bit more at ease with the things that you are doing. Just to be sure, these are all urbanism students.
They are all architecture, Master of Architecture.
Master of Arts. So, okay. So that's actually quite interesting because there's an assumption now that when you start your master's final studios, that you will be asked to design things at a bigger scale with more complexity. But please keep in mind really what design is. It's both analytical as well as projective. And in the same sense, this topic that you are dealing with now is doing exactly that. It is in one part looking at tools in order to take things apart, to deconstruct them and to understand them. And in the second part, it is to actually reunify them in order to say what the urban futures could be. So if we understand the whole question of that, then linking the issue of morphologies just makes it so much easier. Now, you would say, Gerhard, but please, what does the idea of tools and urban morphology have in common, or why is it important for us? Now, in the first instance, let's define what the word means. You may know it or you may not know it, but urban morphology, again, if you separate the words out, there's two meanings. Morphology, morph means Greek in form in Greek. Ology is basically that word that's given to all the sciences. So it's if you put the two together, it is the science of form. It is the science of putting form together, but also understanding those forms. And it's not just a question of formal production, like in an architectural sense, where we need to design a building that looks like Zaha Hadid's or Terry Farrell, but it's actually an understanding on the implications of what those forms do. And if you take those forms and you embed them in the city, the forms have a very different meaning than just pure object-driven intention. Historically, form was very closely associated to the society that was in those cities. If you think back, and I assume you've done your history of architecture, if you think back to the Renaissance with the Renaissance house, the piano nobile, that level above the floor, everyone in that cubic structure had a specific place. And what I mean by everyone, I mean the servants, the house owner, the guest. So it was very easy to determine where you were in a social rank in that time based on the form. Where you resided, what you had access to, gave meaning to your existence. The same thing we can say if we take simple buildings as formal structures and we place them all over the city. We know what, in those times, what a courthouse looked like. We know that every city required a bathhouse. They didn't have bathrooms in those days. Every city required a temple. Every city required some sort of entertainment or the forum. So in the end, the design of those structures and the form, the actual plan and volumetric form that those structures had meaning in terms of what the city was and how it worked. So if you look at this in terms of morphology, the study of form, it means trying to understand what forms would be required for society in the city to function. If we go deeper into that notion of what urban morphology is, we can see it's a systemic tool, and that means there is a science associated to the classification of forms and spaces. If I say to some of the researchers currently doing work on the analysis of space, you will all probably define the interior of your buildings through a functional layout. A washroom, a kitchen, a corridor, a bedroom, a lounge, an entryway, a portico, a threshold, a basement, a garage, a vestibule, a mezzanine level, or even the mansard space under the roof. So what you then realize is in terms of your building itself, it's easy to associate functionalities. In terms of city structure, the systemic tool is in fact understanding that the building types become the important directors of the society. Second of all, you can count those number of buildings in any city. So you can say, oh, one city has more courthouses than another one. One city has more bathhouses than another. One city has bigger infrastructure than another. So all of a sudden, the understanding of the premise of what that environment is can be quantified. It has a number. And that number, you can even go one step further and associate a square foot or square meter area to it. So you then can even start positioning that one level above and say, well, it's a normal or it's a mega structure. So you can then start seeing just how useful the idea of morphology becomes. A lot of theorists and a lot of architects would dismiss the premise of it because they would say, oh, it is just form, or it is just something that you copy paste, right, over and over and over. But in fact, it is scientific. Over the last few years, the last 7 years basically, we've become really interested in what drives urban development across Hong Kong and the GBA. And that premise, we have decided as a direction to choose is simply a morphological direction. And that's important because it gives us, again, that metric and it gives us that level of analysis. So we keep on looking at the same area, but we bring different players into this scenario formulations of what is urban morphology, how do we use it, how do we understand the GBA in a different way, and we come to different conclusions every time. So it's not as, I would really advise you, it's not a once-off thing for you to use and then later abandon, but it is something you can keep on using as a lifelong tool for lifelong learning. My personal research, my PhD was on morphology. You will see some examples of it later. But since then, I have now made the step that goes from the flat understanding to a more three-dimensional understanding of cities. Now, this body of work is something that is still in development, and it means that it's getting more complicated and more complex with more variables as we go on. But just that you know, this is a traditional way of looking at cities. We all know that. We know the Nolli map of Rome, or actually Piranesi's classification of certain prison spaces, but it's easy to define and see that as a way of building cities. The problem is that cities are going vertical, and that verticality, as you all know in Hong Kong, adds layers of complexity, it adds layers of mobile integration, it adds layers of infrastructure, whether you are underground, above ground, or way up above any surface area. Now, if you start looking at, and this is another way, if you start looking at the integration models, which all the designers and engineers love, it's another metric that you can say, actually, like space syntax, if you run a certain formulation and scenario, we can give you a number associated to how these things integrate or intensify in use. And I use the word intensity here because that is the new metric that people are talking about. So you can see just how we go through all these layers in order to get to where we are actually heading in a morphological sense. Now, the city is also getting even more complicated because what we see with urbanization is not a simple question of adding more and an increase in population, but we're talking about socioeconomic issues We're talking about scale relations that are changing, which we see in Europe. We see this in America. We see this in South America. We see this in parts of Africa, where the scale of development is radically different to what we thought we understood. It is not anymore a single city. It is not anymore 10 villages. It is encompassing, like the GBA, nearly 90 million people. And this is just one area. And everyone wants to have a piece of that big structure. So the real question is, how do we as designers, what do we provide in order to have a better environment? And then, of course, environmental vulnerability. What surprised me a lot is a lot of other universities would come and they would talk about this vulnerability of the environment, and they would keep on thinking about it. So you get environmental questions like, and maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't. Resilience. Has any one of you heard about urban resilience as a question? No? Believe me, for about 5 years now, everyone has been talking about urban resilience. But if you say to someone, show me what resilience really looks like in an urban form, what is the density, what is the spatial configuration that the building should have in terms of the plots, no one knows, because no one is doing the formal analysis and no one is doing the scenarios to support all those different types of resilience. We're talking about biophysical systems. Everyone wants to say something about biophysical systems, but if you say, okay, what is the scale, then they probably will rely on urban geographers. But no one is really doing the design ideas as a projection of what could be possible for those vulnerable environments. So you can see we have our jobs cut out for us. And it doesn't matter if you're an architect or an urbanist, you will be dealing with this at some point in your career. Yes?
What do you mean by bio?
This is also a new type of area, what scholars are looking at. It basically means that instead of just looking at the post-Anthropocene context, where everything is basically man-made and man-touched, right? That's the whole premise. The biophysical is in fact saying there's an equal part human, equal part biological environment, and it's bringing these two things. It's now called more than human design. It's bringing these two things together and say that the biophysical positions itself as something that we have to address both in terms of scale, processes, planning, habitability. If you really Google it and you look at Google Scholar and you do a little bit of digging, there's a wealth of literature that will be opened and exposed to you that really would say, okay, biophysical we define as this. Biophysical we actually project as that scale. But it really can, in my understanding, go from the very big view of how urban landscape reacts to water, fresh water, salt water, inland water, water that has estuaries, or you can really go straight down to a very, very small, minute scale of certain fauna and flora that changes the habitation of areas. But it's the real question of, okay, what do we just approach it from an analytical side, or can we actually put forward certain design propositions to make it better, control it, alter it, improve it, or worsen it? You have to understand there's a variety of options open to one. Okay? Cool. This, what you see here, is a complex slide, but it basically sets out the challenges that where we've come from as a society to where we are going in terms of our first industrial movement, where we designed with water and steam, because that's basically what the first industrialization moment represented. The second industrial moment in terms of division of labor and the labor forces. The third one is, of course, electronics, IT, and the fourth one is here, we're talking about cyber physical systems, biophysical systems, cyber physical systems. So here you can see what that does, but what it doesn't tell us is in fact where we as designers in our agencies lie: competitiveness, balance between certain questions, and of course, technological enabling. Because that's what everyone is doing, right? You take technology and you feed it through certain streams and it starts doing something. The way that we are using one type of technology versus another type of technology. The trade-offs between harnessing these various types of typology. Why am I showing this? I'm showing this because I think you need to be aware of this, that it's not just a what I would call dry soup that you add water, you stir, and then you consume it. You need to understand the ingredients that go into all these challenges that you will encounter. Now, some of them may be very intangible, but most of them are actually very physical, very material, and very, in this sense, and in my view, it has an urban scale and it has the implication on how you put buildings down on the city surface or on the earth surface. Wow, we're only getting to the question now after all of this background. Right. Can we still rely on the traditional morphological schools? Is the real question. I don't know if you know, but there's actually 4 schools of urban analysis and urban morphology. Can you all see that? Can I write? The first one is probably the most obvious, which starts off with the Italian school. I mean, the Italians got it right because of understanding cities way better than anyone else could from the start. So you have the Italian school and you have what they call type morphological analysis, where type really drives the entire analysis. So the building type, the church type, the forum type, the bathhouse, all these have different types. So we're looking at types and housing types. And that was an easy one because it was a very simple way of starting to talk about classification of the city. The second morphological school is the French school. The French school actually makes it even more complicated because they say, well, where this is looking at type, we look at type plus society. So where you have multi-story buildings, yes, the building form and shape is important, but what is important is we have to know who's at what level of that building. Remember that example, the owner of the house, the servant in the house, the cleaner of the house, the guest in the house. If you understand it like that, you can see that they go into much more depth socially. The third one is the English school. Now, this is, if you really want to understand morphology, this is after the Second World War. And what they really do is they become more technical, but they talk about, in fact, this is where the current day paradigm comes in, and it's all about functions, functional zoning. So the zone, so all of the zoning that you encounter today comes from that. And it's also another significant part in Hong Kong because Hong Kong is part of a British legacy of planning and design. So they would go with this way of design, right? The zoning is the determinant factor within most cities today. So we have an industrial zone, a housing zone, a zone for CBDs, central business districts. All those zones come from this school. And then we have the final one. I mean, there's a few more, but the few more is more in terms of configurative analysis. And this is what we call the Delft school, which Shu and I are basically educated in. And that is a simple combination of, you cannot see one building or one form on its own. You have to view the plot, the street, the neighborhood scale, and the building all in the same go in order to understand its purpose. That's the Delft school. But the real question is, that's easy to do if you don't have computational devices, if you don't have GIS, if you don't have space syntax, if you don't have any of the other digital assets that help everyone else today. So, but what if you encountered with something like this? Density distribution that is unknown to us. We don't even know what to classify this as. We don't see individual buildings. So what do we do? If we cannot even differentiate between where the center of something is to where the periphery is, what do we do? If we start seeing certain patterns that simply distribute as loosely as this, what school are we going to choose? That is really the question. Is any of that still applicable to the size and the scale of the environment around us? Now, of course, you can say we choose one part And then we choose one of those approaches as an analysis method. But I would say you can also view it another way, where you look at everything at the same time, where you look at the relationship between maybe multiples of the same, where you can still become quite detailed in the quantification of those building types or spatial types. But it presents us with, in effect, this thing, the wicked problem, the problem that is unsolvable. So we have to somehow come to an agreement in how to morphologically address all of that. And I think here comes the real challenge in today's morphological question, and that is, I think, that we cannot rely on the environment as one functional unit anymore. It's impossible. Now, I don't know if you can read that, but what you see, all the cities, Cape Town, right? London. This is the Netherlands. So you can see if you work through all of these, the way that we recognize them through what we saw before is virtually impossible. And I think that here we see the problem already, that the functional, so we cannot associate function to the Birmingham or the English school. We cannot look at building types because we have too many to look at, right? We cannot actually differentiate between what is small and large, because where do you say the scale ends or the scale begins? What scale are you going to do the analysis of? Because if you take one scale, what is large in one scale is small in another. So it becomes really tricky, but you still need that scientific classification in order to understand the environment. And it actually is this, that when we look at the new paradigm, we see that the giga projects are taking over everywhere. Do you recognize any of this? No? Have you seen any of this? No? Be honest if you haven't. Let me put it this way. These three, the socioeconomic vulnerability, environmental vulnerability, and scale relations, that comes from the previous slides. But what I'm trying to establish here is that we are being told that this is the problem or the challenge. And what we see is something very different in terms of trying to understand any of this at another scale. What we now see is, in fact, that there's about more than 9 giga projects being built and constructed in the world. Out of those 9, the one I'm the most familiar with, the Line. I was fortunate enough to actually be there on site 2 years ago, looking at what that does, how it works. You know, when I went, I thought that we're going to arrive in the desert and it's going to be a few hundred people working on the project, but I was shocked because then it was already about 3,000 people in the desert. I'm not talking about construction workers, I'm talking about designers, planners, strategists. Then I hear now the number of people working on it is 5,000, and they've already started, you know, laying the foundations for it. But the point is, if you have something 500 meters in height, which is the height of ICC, and you have it for 75 kilometers in length. So think about that. So that's from the tip of Hong Kong all the way through to Shenzhen. That's about what, 30 kilometers, then another 30 kilometers, and another 15. You probably end up in Guangzhou. And it's one thing that just keeps going. So if you talk about that in terms of urbanization and thinking about scale, then what you really see morphologically is literally a line drawn on the plan. I'm not talking about the internal divisions yet, though. And if we look at other projects, we can see the distribution really, really, really magnified to a level that one wonders, oh, is that really what it is or how it should be? Now, why am I showing you this? Because someone had to decide on the scale. someone had to draw the size of those buildings. Someone had to say, oh, in fact, we understand architecture in one way and the units through which we design in another, but we proposition a very different landscape up there. So it's quite interesting that this idea of morphology is being taken, and it's like oil is added, gayal, they're just adding more and more and more, right? And so the thing gets bigger and it grows and it grows and it grows. So if you look at that, you can see it's already being implemented, it's being thought of. And it comes from a designer's hand. It's not a computer, it's not AI. It comes from a decision process, and it comes from understanding cities in a very specific way, and more so the elements through which we plan and design. So in my view, there's always challenges, right? Hong Kong is challenging us at a morphological level, because what we see here is we understand that part as one layer of one plan. The plan then is easy to replicate in layers. That becomes a cubic thing if you put even more together. Then it goes into a pencil structure, and from the pencil structure, you actually take the same thing, but you extend it down into the subterranean surfaces. And now, what do we talk about morphologically? So is this the morphology? Is that the morphology? Is that the morphology? Or is that the morphology? So in fact, the whole thing here is that giga complexity. And that means, in effect, that what you are looking at on the maps is in fact trying to understand the scale variations. And what is really the new scale that you can use as a tool for analysis. And so I give you this book, Ways to Study and Research Urban Architectural and Technical Design. It was really a book that came out in 2005. That's the later version. But in fact, it was already around in 2001 in Delft. It was written by this guy, Tage de Jong, who was a professor in Delft. He's now retired. But he went to all the professors and said, look, if we want to understand analysis and research, let's get everyone together and talk about it. And they have one specific chapter in that, which is really amazing, because it says there's a chapter called naming concepts. And concepts is really a powerful thing to think about. If you call a chapter naming concepts, it means you have the power to differentiate between analytical units, because concept is that unit. You can define a unit. And in that, he says there's 22 scale variations, and the scale variations tell us exactly what the objects are that we have to do the analysis on, and it is part of a material domain. So it's not something that's intangible. It is not in the internet. It's actually things we touch. So think about it. With you as a generation who is so obsessed with everything on the mobile phone and the interface, what this is saying already in 2005, 20 years ago, says only things that you can touch can have a scale relationship. And that's powerful, because it means you can always come back to this as the foundational side to your way of analysis. And it looks like this. 22, I only have from 8 to 22 here, because if we go, this is 1 meter scale radius. So 1 meter means everything within 1 meter that you can define, measure, and draw. And basically what they say, it's a building part. That makes sense. If you look at scale number 8, it says 3 meter radius, and then it's a building segment. So now it goes from part to a segment. A 10 meter radius, that means you classify building. A 30 meter radius, you talk about building complex. So one building part, many building parts go to building segments. Many building segments make a building. Many buildings make a building complex. Then many building complexes make an ensemble. That's 100 meters. Then we go to 300 meters, it's a neighborhood. Then we go to 1 kilometer, which is an area or a village. 3 kilometers that go to a local district or borough as an area. 10 kilometers, we go to sub-regional. 30 kilometers, we go to regional, sub-regional, regional. 100 kilometers, we go to sub-national. 300 kilometers, we go to national. 1,000 kilometers, we go to subcontinental. 3,000 kilometers to continental and more than 10,000 kilometers, we end up at global. Something to think about. And if you break it down, it looks like this in terms of the scale orders. But I put the images there because I think it's actually more powerful to see really the elements, what they, in our language, in terms of the drawings, in terms of how they are conveyed, what it really means. But the traditional morphological language looks like this. But Gerhard, we just spoke about giga projects. So what are we talking about? Are we still, is this still working for us? Is everyone still with me up until this point? Remember, 20 years ago, this is what someone said is the scale definitions of order. The problem here was they classify 30 kilometers as regional for the Netherlands. Yeah. 100 kilometers is subnational. For the Netherlands, yes. But if we start talking about GBA, what are we talking about? Is it still the same? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. So my real question is, and here you can see, submaterial, 1 millimeter, 3 millimeters, 10 millimeters. You can see how it all just increases. But my real question is low still low and is high still high? Because if you think about it, when we start looking at giga projects, giga cities, giga regions, or regional design, that we don't really design for a neighborhood anymore at 300 meters. I mean, 300 meters, in fact, in this Chinese sense, is actually 300 meters, in fact, the building. If you really think about it. So basically what I'm saying is this classification to the nominal radius is shifting in China, if we understand Chinese urbanization in this sense. And this is where I think this can help you probably the most in the things that you're doing. It's deciding on which area you choose to scale your objects at, and then say we look at one specific portion and that's where we want to go. I'm coming back to this. Any questions? Because I think this is the fundamental part of the task that you have at hand, right? In the liquid territories at this moment. Any questions? Remember what I'm saying. This is actually moving down in terms of what the building units and building elements are. So you will capture more information, more elements in shorter spaces, so shorter scales, smaller scales. Right. So my thesis looked like this. And you can see I was really trying to understand what it really means to look at the city, but not using the traditional type morphological approach. So I did exactly like you guys. I went through all the exercises. I redrew everything. What does it really mean in order to capture areas? Can we talk about a morphological understanding of the city without thinking about building components? And you can see all these urban geography models. That is the Soberg's hierarchical model, which said, okay, pre-industrial cities work like this. Center point is important, periphery is less important. Then in the modernist period or post-industrial period, you've got representations like that, where you get sectoral models of the form of the city being broken. Then the version after that is cities became even more fractured, and then you get a whole different relational model, trying to understand where the building elements are, how they work together. In the end, that was my thesis. That things are not related to a classification of a building element, but it's a relational structure, that things relate to certain networks. If you look at something there, the relationship is to a certain movement. It's a complicated argument. I won't go into that now, but you can see how people are taking the morphological premise and trying to test it through other lenses. And it's important that you do have the freedom to explore it, but you can only do the exploration once you've gone through the basic premise, the foundational stuff, the stuff that you are doing now, the tracing, so to say. So don't think that you cannot do it. You can do it, but you have to learn to swim first before you can cross the entire lake. Okay, just as a heads up. In the end, that functional premise looks like this, where we now start looking at different functions layered on top of one another, that we see this as a morphological unit, and that is a morphological unit, and not necessarily buildings alone anymore. Right. Now, morphologies as design, part 2. Welcome to your future. Yes, Masters of Architecture, great. But there's going to be a moment that someone in an office says, please give us an idea of what 20 of these buildings will look like and how it will actually sit into the urban setting. And this is where you think back on this course that you're taking, because understanding the elements through which you are going to map and busy mapping, one, it gives you a better perspective of things that are old, existing, but also things that could be new. If you look at how buildings densify, they cluster, how you actually rethink the green spaces of the city, how you rethink how infrastructure integrates within your building envelopes. This is you, this is your role, whether you like it or not. The way that you plan certain functional distributions across a vast area could be quite speculative at the beginning. And remember, this is all from our student work. It may start like this, it may have a second step like that, but in the end, it all comes down to an actual proposition like this. And when you understand the morphological units that scale the elements that you did the analysis of, then you also understand how you can take that very same thing and pull it apart, change it, transform it, mutate it, and come up with a new idea. The high-rise pencil towers that we all see, yes, some developers will say that's what we want. But you could easily say, yeah, that's great, but what if we have a different configuration of those towers and we integrate the towers with another typology and we put forward a very different proposition? And that is what, now I'm going to make your eyes roll. This is what MVDRV, OMA, this is what they do. Because they all come from this typological tradition. Believe me, Winning Mars was my boss in Delft. I know what the guy says. I know how he talks. It all starts from the typological discussion. Is the house still a house? Is the factory still a factory? Is the market still a market? The new building in Taiwan, the market, oh yeah, it's a market. But actually, isn't that a municipal service building that they actually took, exploded, took all the facades away, reconfigured the typologies to put them in a way that you don't really expect them to work in the way they do, and then say, there we go. That's the difference. I really think that if you understand the premise of this, then it's easier for you to become a better designer. And of course, some of these designers will argue, they will say, no, but that's not how we did it. But in the end, if you look at the processes, they understand typology very well. And you can only break typology if you understand typology. You can only break the morphology if you understand the units that make it. That is why this as a course is essential, I think, as a maybe a small stepping stone for you, but an important one, regardless. Okay. And then taking that one step further, apart from understanding that morphology, it's all about that. None of this is real. Everything here is speculative. These are all student work that actually this is undergraduate work that comes from our student that deals with typologies. But that is all master's work. Dealing with speculative propositions on what really an environment can look like, what really new forms of stacking and principles can be, what really forms of integrating public and private spaces could mean. So, in conclusion, if we look at what the tool centeredness really means for morphology, I would say it's possibly a three-step system where you understand the units, the relationality of the units that is in the city, the various scales, but also you can actually shift these scales and shift these orders. And then finally, bringing in these different design values. One of the design values that you will also hear today is compaction by him. His thesis was on this, right? He's going to talk about compaction. So that is an understanding of what compaction is really. It's not about adding more for the sake of more. It has a whole different premise, but it also has a morphological value. You must understand that Henry did his PhD on compaction in the framework of morphology. Another student, Darren, did it on resilience in terms of morphology. Joshua is doing it in terms of, I would say, sustainability and liquid territories. So you can see we're all sitting side by side doing the same stuff, but everyone contributing a little bit differently. Right. And that's why I put this here. It's trying to bring together where I started and ending it off where you are today, having to look at the maps. What we call map scrutiny, map criticism, trying to understand what the units are. Where do we zoom in? What are the mega projects? Mega projects as airports, dams, containers, mega projects as barriers, mountain areas, bays, water bays, right? Mega projects as building projects that are done in one go. Team Heat, for example, the airport, Kaita. All these things you could separate up in terms of mega phenomena that is driving urbanization. The bridges, you count how many bridges Hong Kong has built over the last 10 years. You'll be surprised. Tunnel structures, the numbers of maybe even the way that ferry ports and the Hong Kong port is operating, the scale that it's playing in terms of an industrial sector, that's a mega project. So just by standing here, one can easily list the mega project one after another. Okay. So I really hope it helped you.